The sterile scent of antiseptic hung heavy in the air, a constant, unwelcome reminder of the nightmare Lee Min-ho was living. His son, barely a week old, had vanished. One moment, the tiny bundle was nestled in his incubator, the next, the space was empty, the rhythmic beeping of the monitors a mocking soundtrack to his despair. The hospital, usually a place of hope and healing, had become a labyrinth of unanswered questions and mounting dread. "Where is he?" Min-ho pleaded, his voice raw with desperation. He gripped the white coat of Dr. Choi, the head pediatrician, his knuckles bone-white. "You have to find him. Please." Dr. Choi, a man usually radiating calm assurance, looked defeated. "We are doing everything we can, Mr. Lee. The entire hospital is on lockdown. Security is reviewing the CCTV footage. We've alerted the police." His words, though meant to reassure, offered little comfort. The minutes bled into hours, each one an eternity. The police investigation was swift, but yielded nothing. The security footage showed no one entering or leaving the neonatal ward during the crucial time window. It was as if the baby had simply evaporated. Suspicion, thick and suffocating, began to permeate the air. Had someone from inside the hospital been involved? Days turned into weeks, and the hope that had flickered so brightly began to dim. Min-ho, a successful businessman known for his unwavering resolve, found himself crumbling under the weight of his grief. He haunted the hospital, a ghost in its sterile corridors, desperately searching for any clue, any sign that his son was still alive. His wife, Soo-jin, remained sedated, her fragile state unable to bear the crushing reality of their loss. Amidst the chaos and despair, one person remained a quiet, steadfast presence, Mrs. Kim, their housekeeper. A woman of few words and unwavering loyalty, she had been with the family for years, a silent observer of their lives. She moved through the house with a quiet efficiency, tending to the neglected garden, preparing meals that went largely uneaten, and offering a comforting presence in the face of unimaginable grief. One afternoon, weeks after the disappearance, Mrs. Kim approached Min-ho, her face etched with a mixture of fear and determination. "Mr. Lee," she said, her voice barely a whisper. I need to tell you something. It's about the hospital, and Nurse Park." Min-ho, his eyes bloodshot and weary, looked at her with a flicker of renewed interest. Nurse Park was one of the senior nurses in the neonatal ward, a woman known for her competence and dedication. She had been one of the first to comfort him after his son's disappearance. What could Mrs. Kim possibly know? "What is it, Mrs. Kim?" he asked, his voice laced with a desperate plea. Mrs. Kim hesitated, her gaze darting nervously around the room. I overheard something," she stammered. "A conversation between Nurse Park and another nurse. It was a few days before your son disappeared." She took a deep breath, her hands trembling. "They were talking about a baby. A baby that Nurse Park had given up for adoption, many years ago. 10 years ago, to be exact. And they were saying that she regretted it. That she wanted him back." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Min-ho stared at Mrs. Kim, his mind reeling. Could it be possible? Could Nurse Park, this seemingly compassionate woman, have been involved in his son's disappearance? "Tell me everything, Mrs. Kim," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Everything you heard." And as Mrs. Kim began to unravel the threads of Nurse Park's carefully constructed life, a decade-old secret began to emerge, a secret that would expose a web of lies, deceit, and a desperate act of maternal longing that threatened to shatter everything Min-ho thought he knew. The search for his son was far from over, it was only just beginning. And the truth, he suspected, would be far more devastating than he could ever have imagined. Mrs. Kim recounted the hushed tones, the furtive glances she'd witnessed. The conversation had been fragmented, snippets of regret and yearning, spoken in Korean that, while fluent, she rarely used within the Lee household, making the content all the more striking. She remembered Nurse Park lamenting the decision she'd made a decade ago, pressured by circumstances and a lack of support. The other nurse, whose name Mrs. Kim didn't know, had cautioned her against dwelling on the past, reminding her of the stable life she had built. But Nurse Park's reply, Mrs. Kim recalled vividly, was filled with a raw, aching desperation. Stable? What good is stability when your heart is empty? I gave away my son, and I've regretted it every single day since. Min-ho listened, his face a mask of disbelief and growing anger. The pieces were beginning to fall into place, painting a disturbing picture of a woman consumed by regret, a woman who might have been driven to desperate measures. He immediately contacted the police, relaying Mrs. Kim's information. Detective Lee, a seasoned investigator who had been assigned to the case, arrived within the hour. Detective Lee, a man with a weary face and sharp eyes that missed nothing, listened intently to Mrs. Kim's account. He asked detailed questions, probing for any inconsistencies or uncertainties. He then turned to Min-ho, his expression grim. This is a significant development, Mr. Lee. We need to question Nurse Park immediately. The questioning of Nurse Park took place in a sterile, windowless room at the hospital. She was initially cooperative, expressing shock and concern over the disappearance of Min-ho's son. She spoke of her dedication to her profession, her love for children, and her unwavering commitment to the well-being of her patients. I would never do anything to harm a child, Mr. Lee, she insisted, her voice trembling slightly. I understand your pain, your desperation. But I assure you, I had nothing to do with this. Detective Lee, however, was not convinced. He subtly shifted his questioning, probing into her personal life, her past. He asked about her family, her relationships, and eventually, about the child she had given up for adoption 10 years ago. Nurse Park's composure faltered. Her eyes darted nervously around the room, and her breathing became shallow. She admitted to having given birth to a son, but claimed that the adoption had been a closed one, with no contact since. She insisted that she had come to terms with her decision and that she was now content with her life. It was a difficult time in my life, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I was young, alone, and unable to provide for a child. I did what I thought was best for him. Detective Lee pressed her further, asking about her recent conversations with other nurses, about any expressions of regret she might have voiced. Nurse Park denied everything, her denials growing increasingly frantic. I haven't spoken to anyone about my son in years, she insisted. Mrs. Kim must have misunderstood something. She's an old woman, perhaps her memory is failing. But Detective Lee was not buying it. He had seen this kind of denial before, the desperate attempts to conceal the truth. He decided to change tactics. Nurse Park, he said, his voice calm but firm. We have security footage from the hospital. We know that you entered the neonatal ward several times on the night of the disappearance, even when you weren't scheduled to be there. Can you explain that? Nurse Park paled. Her carefully constructed facade began to crumble, revealing the fear and desperation that lay beneath. She stammered, trying to come up with an explanation, but the words caught in her throat. I was just checking on the patients, she said weakly. I wanted to make sure everything was all right. And why were you seen carrying a large bag out of the ward, Nurse Park? Detective Lee continued, his voice relentless. The silence in the room was deafening. Nurse Park stared at Detective Lee, her eyes wide with terror. She knew that she had been caught. Finally, she broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. Okay, she cried. I did it. I took the baby. The confession sent a shockwave through the hospital. Min-ho, who had been waiting anxiously outside the interrogation room, felt a mixture of relief and anger. Relief that his son was, hopefully, still alive, and anger at the woman who had caused him so much pain. Where is he? Min-ho demanded, bursting into the room. Where is my son? Nurse Park, her face streaked with tears, looked up at him, her eyes filled with remorse. He's safe, she said. He's with me. I would never hurt him. She explained that she had taken the baby out of desperation, driven by an overwhelming desire to have her own son back. She had seen Min-ho's son as a second chance, a way to fill the void in her heart. I know it was wrong, she sobbed. I know I've caused you unimaginable pain. But I couldn't help myself. I just wanted to be a mother again. She revealed that she had taken the baby to her apartment, a small, sparsely furnished place on the outskirts of the city. She had been caring for him, feeding him, and showering him with the love she had denied her firstborn. Detective Lee immediately dispatched a team of officers to Nurse Park's apartment. Min-ho followed, his heart pounding with anticipation. He couldn't wait to see his son again, to hold him in his arms and assure him that everything was all right. The officers arrived at the apartment and cautiously entered. They found the baby asleep in a makeshift crib, surrounded by baby clothes and toys. He was unharmed, healthy, and seemingly well cared for. Min-ho rushed to the crib and gently picked up his son. He held him close, tears streaming down his face. He was finally safe, finally back in his arms. The reunion was bittersweet. While Min-ho was overjoyed to have his son back, he was also deeply disturbed by the events that had led to his disappearance. He couldn't understand how a woman who was supposed to be caring for his child could have been capable of such a cruel and selfish act. Nurse Park was arrested and charged with kidnapping. Her career was ruined, her reputation shattered. She faced a long prison sentence, a consequence of her desperate act. Soo-jin, still fragile and recovering from the trauma, was slowly brought back into the loop, the news of their son's recovery carefully delivered by Dr. Choi. The reunion between mother and son was heart-wrenching, a flood of tears and whispered promises of protection. The hospital, once a symbol of hope, was now tainted by scandal. Dr. Choi, deeply shaken by the events, launched an internal investigation to determine how Nurse Park had been able to carry out her plan undetected. He vowed to implement stricter security measures to prevent such a tragedy from ever happening again. In the aftermath of the ordeal, Min-ho and Soo-jin struggled to rebuild their lives. The experience had left them scarred, but also strengthened their bond. They were determined to provide their son with a loving and secure home, a refuge from the darkness that had threatened to consume them. But the questions lingered. What would become of Nurse Park? Could they ever truly forgive her? And how could they ensure that their son would never be affected by the events of his early days? The case of Lee Min-ho's son was a stark reminder of the fragility of life, the power of desperation, and the enduring strength of the human spirit. It was a story that would stay with them forever, a constant reminder of the nightmare they had survived and the precious gift they had almost lost. As Min-ho looked down at his sleeping son, nestled safely in his arms, he knew that their journey was far from over. They had a long road ahead, a road filled with healing, forgiveness, and the unwavering commitment to love and protect their child, no matter what the future held. The media frenzy surrounding the case was relentless. Every news outlet in South Korea, and even some internationally, covered the story of the kidnapped baby and the nurse's shocking secret. The public was divided, some condemning Nurse Park as a monster, others seeing her as a tragic figure driven to extreme measures by grief. Min-ho and Soo-jin tried their best to shield themselves and their son from the constant scrutiny. They retreated to their secluded home, relying on Mrs. Kim to manage the household and protect their privacy. Soo-jin, though physically recovered, was still emotionally fragile. She clung to her son, barely letting him out of her sight, haunted by the thought of what could have happened. Min-ho, ever the pragmatist, focused on ensuring his family's safety and stability. He hired a team of security guards to patrol their property and implemented strict protocols for anyone entering their home. He also sought legal counsel to navigate the complexities of the case against Nurse Park and to secure his son's future. One evening, as Soo-jin was feeding their son, she looked up at Min-ho, her eyes filled with worry. Do you think he'll remember any of this?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Min-ho knelt beside her, taking her hand in his. "No," he said firmly. "He was too young. We'll make sure he only remembers the love and happiness we give him." But deep down, Min-ho wasn't so sure. He knew that trauma, even at a young age, could leave lasting scars. He resolved to do everything in his power to protect his son from the lingering effects of the ordeal. Meanwhile, the investigation into Nurse Park's past revealed a tragic story. 10 years prior, she had given birth to a son who was tragically stillborn. The loss had devastated her, and she had never fully recovered. According to Mrs. Kim, who had occasionally crossed paths with Nurse Park at local markets, the nurse had always seemed withdrawn and melancholic. The revelation shed light on Nurse Park's motives, but it didn't excuse her actions. Min-ho struggled with conflicting emotions. He felt sympathy for her pain, but he couldn't forgive her for the anguish she had caused his family. As Nurse Park's trial approached, Min-ho received a letter from her. In it, she expressed her deepest remorse and begged for forgiveness. She didn't expect him to understand, she wrote, but she wanted him to know that she never intended to harm his son. She had only wanted to fill the void in her own heart. Min-ho showed the letter to Soo-jin. They read it together, silently contemplating the woman who had so profoundly impacted their lives. "What do you think we should do?" Soo-jin asked, her voice trembling. Min-ho sighed. "I don't know," he admitted. "I don't think I can ever forgive her completely. But I also don't want to be consumed by hatred. It won't bring us peace." After much deliberation, they decided to visit Nurse Park in prison. They wanted to see her face to face, to understand her pain, and to find a way to move forward. The visit was emotionally charged. Nurse Park, her face pale and drawn, broke down in tears when she saw them. She apologized profusely, her words filled with genuine remorse. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness," she sobbed. "But I hope that one day, you can find it in your hearts to forgive me." Min-ho and Soo-jin listened in silence, their hearts aching with a mixture of anger, pity, and confusion. They didn't offer forgiveness, but they didn't condemn her either. They simply acknowledged her pain and expressed their hope that she would find peace. As they left the prison, Min-ho and Soo-jin felt a sense of closure. They knew that the scars of the past would always be with them, but they were determined to move forward and build a brighter future for their son. The trial concluded with Nurse Park being sentenced to several years in prison. While some felt the sentence was too lenient, others believed it was just, considering the circumstances. In the years that followed, Min-ho and Soo-jin dedicated themselves to raising their son in a loving and supportive environment. They told him about his early days, but they carefully avoided dwelling on the trauma of his disappearance. They wanted him to know that he was loved, cherished, and protected. As their son grew older, he showed no signs of being affected by the events of his infancy. He was a happy, well-adjusted child who thrived in school and enjoyed spending time with his family and friends. One day, when he was about 10 years old, he came home from school with a question. "Dad," he said, "did something bad happen to me when I was a baby?" Min-ho and Soo-jin exchanged a nervous glance. They had always known that this day would come. Min-ho knelt down and looked his son in the eye. "Yes," he said gently. "Something did happen. But it's all over now. You're safe, and we love you very much." He then proceeded to tell his son the story of his disappearance, carefully tailoring the details to his age and understanding. He emphasized the love and dedication of his parents and the happy ending to the story. His son listened intently, his eyes wide with wonder. When Min-ho finished, he hugged his son tightly. "I'm so glad you're okay," he said. From that day forward, their son knew the truth about his past. But it didn't define him. He was a resilient and loving child who had overcome adversity and emerged stronger than ever. Min-ho and Soo-jin had succeeded in creating a haven of love and security for their son, a place where he could thrive and reach his full potential. They had turned a tragedy into a triumph, a testament to the power of love, forgiveness, and the enduring strength of the human spirit. Years later, Min-ho found himself reflecting on the events that had shaped his life. He had learned valuable lessons about the importance of family, the fragility of life, and the capacity for both good and evil in the human heart. He had also learned that even in the darkest of times, there is always hope. Hope for healing, hope for forgiveness, and hope for a brighter future. As he looked at his son, now a young man on the cusp of adulthood, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. He was grateful for the love of his family, for the support of his friends, and for the opportunity to live a life filled with purpose and meaning. The nightmare of his son's disappearance had long since faded into a distant memory, replaced by the joy and fulfillment of watching his son grow into a kind, compassionate, and successful young man. And in that moment, Min-ho knew that he had finally found peace. The scars of the past would always be there, but they no longer defined him. He had emerged from the darkness stronger and more resilient than ever before. He had learned to forgive, to love, and to appreciate the precious gift of life. And that, he realized, was the greatest triumph of all. Nurse Park, the woman who had once held his son in her arms, was now a pariah, her life irrevocably altered by a single, desperate act. The hushed whispers followed her even within the prison walls. Mrs. Kim's revelation had been the key that unlocked a Pandora's box of secrets and lies. The morning after Nurse Park's confession, the hospital was in turmoil. Dr. Choi, his face etched with a mixture of shock and professional embarrassment, summoned Min-ho and Soo-jin to his office. Soo-jin, still fragile, was supported by Min-ho, her eyes vacant, reflecting the trauma she couldn't yet process. "Mr. Lee," Dr. Choi began, his voice grave, "I can only express my deepest apologies. What happened, it's an unspeakable breach of trust. We are conducting a full internal investigation." Min-ho, his gaze unwavering, cut him off. "An investigation? Doctor, my son disappeared from your hospital. An investigation won't bring back the time we lost. It won't erase the fear and the pain." His voice, though controlled, vibrated with barely suppressed fury. Soo-jin, stirred from her stupor by the intensity of Min-ho's words, reached out and gripped his hand tightly. The simple gesture was a silent plea for him to remain calm. Dr. Choi sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "I understand your anger, Mr. Lee. I assure you, we will cooperate fully with the authorities. Nurse Park's confession, it's beyond comprehension. We had no indication, no prior issues." "Prior issues?" Min-ho scoffed. "She was hiding a pregnancy for 10 years. How could you not know? What kind of oversight is this?" The doctor remained silent, unable to offer a satisfactory answer. The weight of the hospital's failure pressed heavily on him. Meanwhile, Mrs. Kim, back at the Lee residence, was a whirlwind of quiet efficiency. She prepared a calming tea for Soo-jin and ensured that the house was a sanctuary from the storm raging outside. Her loyalty to the family was unwavering, a beacon of stability in the midst of chaos. Later that day, detectives arrived at the hospital, their presence casting a long shadow over the already tense atmosphere. They interviewed staff, reviewed security footage, and meticulously examined Nurse Park's records. The truth, painstakingly pieced together, was even more disturbing than they had initially imagined. Nurse Park, it turned out, had been secretly struggling with infertility for years. The desire to have a child had consumed her, driving her to increasingly desperate measures. The adoption process had been fraught with setbacks, and the emotional toll had been immense. When Soo-jin gave birth to a healthy baby boy, something inside Nurse Park had snapped. Driven by a twisted sense of entitlement and desperation, she had seen an opportunity to fulfill her lifelong dream. The confession revealed she had planned the abduction meticulously, exploiting her position and knowledge of the hospital's routines. She had arranged for a couple, equally desperate for a child and easily manipulated, to take the baby, promising them a life of happiness and security. The money they paid, she had planned to use to flee the country. The authorities tracked down the couple in a small rural village. They were initially resistant, clinging to the child they had come to believe was their own. But when confronted with the overwhelming evidence and the anguish of the Lee family, they finally relented. The reunion between Minho, Soo-jin, and their son was a moment of profound emotion. Soo-jin, finally emerging from her medicated haze, cradled her son in her arms, tears streaming down her face. Minho stood beside her, his heart overflowing with relief and gratitude. The road to recovery, however, was long and arduous. Soo-jin struggled with post-traumatic stress, haunted by the fear that her son could be taken from her again. Minho, burdened by guilt and anger, found it difficult to trust anyone. They sought therapy, individually and as a couple, slowly learning to process their trauma and rebuild their lives. Mrs. Kim remained their steadfast support, providing a sense of normalcy and stability during a time of immense upheaval. The legal proceedings against Nurse Park were swift and decisive. The evidence was overwhelming, and she offered no defense. The court sentenced her to a lengthy prison term, a punishment that reflected the severity of her crime. In the aftermath of the trial, Minho and Soo-jin made a conscious decision to focus on the future. They enrolled their son in a private school with enhanced security measures, and they became actively involved in his life, determined to create a safe and loving environment. They also became advocates for stricter hospital security protocols and improved mental health support for healthcare professionals. They wanted to ensure that no other family would have to endure the nightmare they had experienced. Years passed, and the scars of the past began to fade. Their son grew into a bright and well-adjusted young man, unaware of the trauma that had marked his infancy. Minho and Soo-jin found solace in their love for each other and their son, building a life filled with joy, laughter, and gratitude. One evening, as they sat on their veranda, watching their son play in the garden, Minho turned to Soo-jin and took her hand. "We made it," he said softly. "We survived." Soo-jin smiled, her eyes filled with tears of happiness. "Yes," she replied. "We did." The sun set, casting a warm golden glow over their home, a symbol of the love and resilience that had brought them through the darkest of times. The past would always be a part of their story, but it would no longer define them. They had emerged from the ashes, stronger and more united than ever before. And they knew, with unwavering certainty, that their love would endure, forever binding them together. The tranquility of their veranda, however, was a fragile thing. Though years had passed, the phantom of Nurse Park's betrayal lingered, a subtle tremor beneath the surface of their seemingly idyllic life. Minho found himself constantly checking on his son, a habit Soo-jin gently tried to dissuade, knowing the boy deserved a life unburdened by their past fears. One day, a letter arrived. It was postmarked from the prison where Nurse Park was incarcerated. Minho initially wanted to burn it, to obliterate any lingering connection to that dark chapter. But Soo-jin, her curiosity piqued and perhaps driven by a need for closure she hadn't yet achieved, convinced him to read it. The letter was surprisingly devoid of self-pity or justification. Nurse Park wrote of her regret, not just for the crime itself, but for the pain she had inflicted on the Lee family and the innocent couple she had manipulated. She acknowledged the irreparable damage she had caused and expressed a desire, however futile, to atone for her actions. "I understand if you can never forgive me," she wrote, her words carefully chosen. "But I hope, someday, you can find peace knowing that your son is loved and cherished. My actions were born of desperation, but they were never intended to cause lasting harm to him. He was always meant to be cared for." The letter ended with a single, unexpected request. Nurse Park asked if she could receive a photograph of their son. Just to see him, she wrote, to know that he is well. Minho was furious. How dare she, after everything, presume to ask for anything? But Soo-jin saw something different in the request, a flicker of humanity in a woman she had come to see as a monster. She argued that granting the request, however painful, might be the final step in releasing themselves from the grip of the past. After weeks of agonizing debate, they decided to send a photograph. It was a recent school portrait, their son smiling brightly, his eyes full of life. They sent it without a note, without any acknowledgement other than the image itself. Months later, another letter arrived. This one was shorter, the handwriting shakier. "Thank you," it simply read. "He is beautiful." That was the last they ever heard from Nurse Park. But the act of sending the photograph had a profound effect on the Lee family. It was as if, by acknowledging Nurse Park's existence and her role in their lives, they had finally severed the last thread of her influence. Minho's anxiety began to dissipate. He started to relax, to trust in the security they had built around their son. Soo-jin, too, found a renewed sense of peace, no longer haunted by the fear of another abduction. Their son, now a teenager, began to ask questions about his early life. He sensed the unspoken tension, the underlying sadness that occasionally surfaced between his parents. They decided to be honest with him, to tell him the story of his disappearance and the woman who had orchestrated it. They did so carefully, emphasizing the love and resilience that had brought them through the ordeal. They explained that Nurse Park was a troubled woman who had made a terrible mistake, but that she had ultimately been held accountable for her actions. Their son listened intently, his young face etched with concern. When they finished, he wrapped his arms around them, holding them tightly. "I'm so glad I'm here," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "I'm so glad you're my parents." From that day forward, the past no longer held the same power. It was a part of their history, but it did not define their present or dictate their future. They had faced their demons and emerged victorious, their love stronger, their family more united than ever before. Years later, Minho and Soo-jin stood at their son's graduation, watching him receive his diploma. He had excelled in his studies, earning a place at a prestigious university. As he walked across the stage, his eyes met theirs, and he gave them a knowing smile. In that moment, Minho and Soo-jin knew that they had done everything right. They had protected their son, nurtured his spirit, and taught him the value of love, forgiveness, and resilience. They had transformed a tragedy into a triumph, a story of loss into a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. As the ceremony concluded and the graduates tossed their caps into the air, Minho turned to Soo-jin, his eyes filled with tears of joy. "We did it," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "We gave him the life he deserved." Soo-jin squeezed his hand tightly, her heart overflowing with love and gratitude. "Yes," she replied. "We did." And as they walked hand in hand into the bright future that awaited them, they knew that their love, their family, and their unwavering commitment to each other would continue to guide them through whatever challenges life might bring.